Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Frankly Speaking. And tonight my guest is somebody who has taken off the onerous task of trying to decipher a man who was part of the freedom struggle, yet a man who is seen as divisive and till today echoes in the political ecosystem in India. The man called Veer Savarkar, and author of Savarkar, Echoes from a Forgotten Past, being his first book, Vikram Sampath, now coming out with Volume 2, Savarkar, A Contested Legacy, talking about Savarkar's life and times between 1924 and 1966. Thank you very much, Vikram Sampath, for joining me on Frankly Speaking. And I want to begin from the point where we left off the last book. And I want to ask you, Rahul Gandhi has come out in the past and said, I am not Rahul Savarkar. I will not apologize for telling the truth. This is when he talked about Savarkar apologizing to come out of jail and therefore contesting the fact that he was actually somebody who could be called a freedom fighter. Why do you think Vikram Savarkar till date, does evoke a lot of divisive reactions coming up from the political spectrum, Vikram Sampath?
Hi Navika, always a great pleasure talking to you, and thank you for having me on your show. Savarkar, as I've always maintained, has been a very, very contentious figure. His legacy is something that is contested, and that's why the subtitle of the book too is named so. I mean, you mentioned Rahul Gandhi, his own grandmother, the former Prime Minister of India, Srimati Indira Gandhi, the senior most Congress leader, on Savarkar's death in 1966 had gone on to praise him as a very symbol of patriotism and courage, and his role in the annals of Indian freedom struggle was something that was very, very unique and special. She also got a fund in his name, got a stamp released for him. A documentary film was made by the Information and Broadcasting Ministry then. So I think the Congress party now needs to re-evaluate why one of their tallest leaders was actually then eulogizing, a supposedly or alleged stooge, a British collaborator, an assassin of Mahatma Gandhi, an Islamophobe, and all these epithets that are, thrown at Savarkar. In my assessment, Navika, I think in the 60s and 70s, the Hindu nationalist parties or the so-called right wing was a fringe element. The Jan Sangh was, hardly, very active. The BJP was not even born. So the Congress and its leadership was a little more generous towards icons of the Indian right. But then after the 1990s, with the coming of the first NDA government under Mr. Vajpayee, and the way in which Savarkar's importance started getting elevated in the public discourse, his picture coming up in the Central Hall of Parliament, a plaque in his honor at the cellular jail in Port Blair, it was suddenly realized that this force is something that is there to unseat us. And so ever since then, if you see from the 2000s, is when this whole narrative of him being an apologist and all of that has gathered ground in my view. And there too, I've maintained, even in my first volume, where I've included all the petitions that he signed, about 6 or 7 of them, where none of them is an apology to the British. It is a very normal, legal route that all political prisoners of the time had to write to the government, just like you have a bail application now. You were writing to the government to be released, and he was a lawyer, so he knew the tenets of the law. Plus, he was also acting as a spokesperson for all the other political prisoners who were lodged at cellular jail, because there was no point rotting in jail. He was given a 50-year-long punishment, life imprisonment for 50 long years, so instead of being executed. So these petitions that are spoken about as mercy petitions, I don't call them as mercy petitions at all. They're yachika is the word in Hindi, where you're given the agency of filing a petition, just as you can have a lawyer to fight your case. But despite this, all these allegations that I mentioned, did he call himself Veer? Did he write his own biography in a pseudonym? All of these allegations which have no historical basis or truth, they keep getting hurled at him on and off, only because I think the Congress leadership or the opposition thinks that the best way to get to the BJP today is by attacking one of its ideological forefathers. And this is also the fact to tell, like how Mr. Kharge had, I think, in Parliament said, your dogs also did not participate in the freedom struggle. It's almost to appropriate to the party the fact that they are the main custodians of the freedom movement and thereby the legitimate successors to the throne of India. And anybody else who's occupying that is an outsider, a usurper who doesn't deserve to be there. So I think contemporary politics, intruding history, makes Savarkar and many characters like him a big casualty.
Well, Vikram Sampath, I want to ask you, and you write this in your prologue, and you say that your book was declined bookshelf space in several, several of these stores, bookstores, where they would carry virtually every other book with great pride by Indian authors. The contested legacy of Savarkar hasn't even found too many people as takers in the so-called intelligentsia of today in terms of a review of the book. And these are the self-professed freedom of speech torch bearers. How do you see this? I mean, is this completely a fake view of what freedom of speech is all about? Your freedom is contested to decipher what Savarkar was all about. They won't even acknowledge it in a bookstore or through a review, yet they are the champions of freedom of speech?
Very true, Navika. I think you hit the nail on the head, where the same custodians of freedom of speech, the so-called liberals, who also dominate to a large extent, academia, the media, and cultural bodies. They've almost been gatekeepers where any opposing viewpoint is never allowed to thrive. Particularly in my discipline of history, where world over, where a conservative view is not given as much of an importance. And in India particularly, it's been the Marxist historiography that has ruled the roost since independence. There's a very, narrow narrative that needs to be pushed when it comes to the history of India. And particularly, about the freedom movement, there has to be a very monochromatic, linear, a very simplistic kind of a narrative, like almost playing out like an Attenborough film, where the non-violent movement, for all its importance, and I'm not disparaging that at all, becomes the mainstream, and anybody else is a fringe. So in that, paradigm, Savarkar also becomes, an outsider, so to say. But in his case, there's a double whammy for him. He was the father of Hindutva. He was also someone who was implicated in Mahatma Gandhi's assassination and later acquitted. And so in the years after independence, he was almost a persona non grata. Anybody who even spoke about him or had associations with him, there was a cancel culture against them. Someone of the stature of Mr. Hridaynath Mangeshkar in the 50s and 60s, just because he was close to the Savarkar family and used to tune many of Savarkar's Marathi poems. He was a great poet, and so many of his poems which he tuned, and the Mangeshkar sisters, including Lataji, had sung these. Hridaynath Mangeshkar actually lost his job in the All India Radio, and he's on record stating this. So this was the kind of intolerance that one had for Savarkar in particular. And so that's one reason why in the 50 years since the last biography of Savarkar was written in the 1960s, there's been no scholarly attempt made to re-evaluate him, revisit his life, and also see his relevance in contemporary politics. And that says a lot about Indian scholarship and about all these torchbearers of freedom of speech and expression. In my case too, as you pointed out, the book did well only thanks to this social media and word of mouth. Many booksellers, since I've been a writer for a decade and more, many of them said, we have nothing against the writer, but we would not want to keep this book in our bookstore. So, and many media outlets not reviewing it But despite that, it went on to become a national bestseller. And I think that says a lot about how these organizations and individuals are increasingly irrelevant in New India, where I think an idea can reach out to the masses without all these via medias that one needs to employ.
Well, Vikram Sampath, you do say that, but you know, there's a phrase in Lutyens media or Lutyens circles that goes around that the current dispensation is the one which kills dissent. The current dispensation is the one that does not allow free exchange of ideas and in fact forces overwriting of history. I want to ask you, and I want you to give the liberty to you. No, I'm nobody to give the liberty, but since many media outlets, you say, refuse to even acknowledge or review your work, would you like to name some of the bookstores, some of these people who have said no to actually hosting the book of Savarkar in their stores or reviewing it? Would you like to name them and call them out, or are we in India still in that generation where we are diplomatic and we just like to carry along?
Now you're putting me in a spot. I would, you know, I mean, I don't think the individual matters there, or an individual, you know, media house or an individual bookstore matters. It's, I think, the larger attitude. And I faced this, Navika, earlier too, when, you know, there was the Bangalore Literature Festival that I had founded, you know, and because I'd written an article where during the award Vapsi drama that was going on then, and I was a Sahitya Academy Award winner myself, and I had written an article in a leading newspaper as to why I don't think this is a issue that is worth returning a Sahitya Academy Award for, and that it was politically motivated. There was a cancel culture, and a series of authors, very, very senior authors, all started, you know, those whom we had invited to the festival and who had agreed to be a part of it, they all started moving out. There was a whisper campaign that this is a fascist festival, the organizer is a right-wing person, so let's not go there. And in a huff, I had to actually resign from the festival that I had founded. So this kind of you know, intolerance that we find, I don't think it's a symptom now, right from Nehru's times. In fact, even in this book that I mentioned, after Mahatma Gandhi's assassination, 25,000 you know, people belonging to various Hindu organizations, 20,000 of them only from the RSS, were all detained for no charges on them, only because a few of them were alleged to be you know, ex-members of the RSS. And all through, I mean, in Nehru's regime, you see right from the first amendment, which put curbs on freedom of speech, to also the time when even artists and writers, the maximum number of books that were banned were during that time. Majroo Sultanpuri was put in jail for a year just because he called Nehru you know, Hitler's dog or something like that in a poem. And much later too, you know, even in the 1980s, even before Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran could ban satanic verses, India had gone ahead and banned it. So what, you know, freedom of speech and expression and its stifling of dissent after 2014 are we talking about, when it's been so much a part of our post-independent history, and we suddenly think it was milk and honey then, and all catastrophe broke loose 7 years ago, which is completely erroneous, both from my own personal experiences that I cited, and also to some extent from the history of the nation itself, as we see the long and you know, tarred experience we've had with freedom of speech. This is not something that is right at all.
Well, let me ask you then, Vikram Sampath, when Mr. Jairam Ramesh, a senior leader of the Congress party, reviewed your book and said something interesting in his comments, said, sympathetic but not apologetic, this is a work of considerable scholarship, something difficult to achieve in India as far as writing about public personalities is concerned. My endorsement of Sampath's fine book is as a student of Indian political history and not someone still in active politics who believes that Savarkar is profoundly divisive figure and the very opposite of what Mahatma Gandhi lived for and ultimately killed for as well. Now, I want to ask you, this is candid coming from a congressman, but others in his party would be less honest. So, do you think Mr. Jairam Ramesh is actually more honest than the others, or do you think he's still making the proviso that his political career does not get impacted by the kind of review he writes for your book at an academic level?
Mr. Jairam Ramesh is not just a politician. I think he's also a scholar of several books. So I think it's very gracious of him to review it with, of course, conditions of terms and conditions apply asterisk that was put on the comment. But then I think even sane and sensible people within the Congress, even Dr. Manmohan Singh recently, if you'd remember, he said in a press conference that he in fact said Savarkar ji and said we differ with him on his philosophy of Hindutva, but then we don't consider slandering him as something that needs to be done. Several leaders, Navika, in the past who belong to the Congress, people like Vasant Sathe and others, especially those who came from Maharashtra, they do know the reverence that the man has among people there even now. I think it's largely the juvenile, the not so informed section of the opposition, and particularly the Congress, which goes on with this narrative, which, as I pointed out earlier, is a more recent construct. Post 2000, when this whole thing began with Mr. Mani Shankar Iyer getting the plaque removed from cellular jail, which commemorated Savarkar. But then a lot of sane and sensible elements within the Congress do acknowledge, as I mentioned, even Indira Gandhi having that reverence for this leader and the role that he had to play in the freedom struggle, in the revolutionary movement. They may differ with him ideologically, particularly on matters of Hindutva, on which Gandhi and he were complete polar opposites and their ideologies never met. But so be it. There are contesting viewpoints. There are multiple ideas of India. There's no single idea, the hallowed idea that we are all supposed to live for and bemoan its decline all the time. So let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let there be multiple opinions, and that's what a thriving democracy is supposed to be, which thrives on dissent and debate and differences of opinion in a healthy and an intellectual fashion. So I actually thank Mr. Ramesh that he had the grace to go through the book. He suggested several, gave many constructive feedback about the book too, and was kind enough to be brave to write that review as well for me.
Well, I noticed the word juvenile that you used, especially for the Congress party. If you were a politician, I would have asked you to elaborate because that's what makes for a good headline. But since you are an author, I'll let our viewers understand what your reference was to. But let me ask you now on the book itself and on Savarkar, as you write. Mr. Sampath, you write extensively about how Savarkar during his time in Ratnagiri devoted his time and attention to eradicating caste prejudice, and how he went from village to village and initiated inter-caste functions, inter-caste schools, partaking in Hindu rituals, and how he brought forth societal change. I want to ask you, the fact that casteless society is something that Savarkar stood for, and eradicating of untouchability, was it really motivated from his own attempts to keep Hindus united? Because that's the time that we were living in, where we weren't being able to take on the Britishers simply because we ourselves as a society, as as people belonging to different states and different castes, were divided amongst ourselves.
To an extent, that is true, because one motivation was certainly a consolidation of the Hindu society, the Hindu Sangathan that the Hindu Mahasabha always stood for, where if you remember, this is also the time of the communal award. Electorates were being assigned on the basis of population proportion, and the minorities, particularly the Muslim community, was getting seats which were much more than what was, one person, one man, one vote, or one man, one seat was not the British policy. It was, they were getting disproportionate number of seats in the legislature, in the central parliament, and so on. So in such a scenario, it was very necessary that the different sects and subsects which were there within the Hindu fold, instead of enumerating themselves in the senses as say Arya Samajis or Sanatanis and all of that, Brahmo Samajis and all that, the common word of Hindu to also maintain your numbers, which were very important during that time, and on the basis of which government policies were being decided, that had to be made. But I don't think it was only expediency on the political side or numerical strength that mattered to Savarkar, because right from his Hindutva treatise, which he wrote in the Ratnagiri prison in 1923, he speaks about the 7 shackles or the bandis that hold the Hindu society. Vedokta Bandi, or where the Vedas he thought were universal knowledge and not the preserve of just the Brahmin community, and so this had to be universalized. Vyavsay Bandi, where a profession you take to based on merit and not based on heredity itself. Sparsha Bandi, or untouchability, which had to be eradicated completely. Samudra Bandi, crossing the seas was a legitimate thing according to him and did not lose to loss of caste. Then you had Shuddhi Bandi, those who were forcibly converted out of Hinduism. Was there a way to bring them back into the fold, the Ghar Wapsi of today, which the Arya Samaj actually propounded. So Shuddhi was something he propounded. Roti Bandi and Beti Bandi, which was intercaste dining and intercaste marriage. So all of this was a complete package where he spoke not just of removing of untouchability, but a dismantling of the Varnashram system itself, which he thought was the bedrock of all the evils of the caste system. And in this aspect, his views were very, very similar to that of Dr. Ambedkar. And in fact, I quote Dr. Ambedkar also in the book, where he says, you're the only one who has understood that the evil of the caste system finds its roots in the Varna system, and its eradication is what is more important. Gandhi, on the other hand, at the same time was on a complete different tangent, where he was saying, I believe in the Varna system and I believe that that is the fundamental bedrock of Hinduism. Removing the Varnashram Dharma is going to actually lead to the collapse of Hinduism. And he also famously said, everybody cannot become a viceroy or a prime minister. You had to be born in a particular family, you had to have certain leadership genes. Only then you can aspire to the highest post, which was, I think, very, very antithetical to what democracy is, where a chai wala can become a prime minister. You don't have to be a dynast to actually aspire for the highest post in the country. So it's very interesting to see that, in this time, the annihilation of caste was something that the father of Hindutva was sharing his views with Dr. Ambedkar. The popular perception is Hindutva stands for Manuvad and upper caste hegemony and all of that, whereas the writings and Savarkar's own actions, it was not just theory, but putting a lot of that into practice. Like you mentioned, the first ever intercaste dining cafe in Ratnagiri in India, the first ever temple called the Patit Pavan Mandir, which was open to members of all castes and communities, that was opened there in 1931. Schools for children of all castes and communities, a complete annihilation, a complete removal of not only untouchability but all caste differences, both for the nation and the society's progress, as also the consolidation of Hindu society for electoral purposes, for political strength. That was the vision of Savarkar.
Vikram Sampath, I really want to ask you this question. Who do you think really carries forward the legacy of Savarkar? Because he wanted caste system to go away. The right wing, the BJP, the RSS still plans its elections on the basis of caste. There are reservations on the basis of caste that are still done, in various institutions, in various educational institutions, jobs, etc. On the other hand, while Gandhi, as you said, propounded the theory of you have to be born in the ruling class to be part of the ruling class, that has been turned on its head. Yet, the present day government, which is trying to revive Savarkar, doesn't follow Savarkar in toto, nor does it follow Gandhi in toto, because they haven't really given the recognition that many in the right wing would want for Savarkar. No Bharat Ratna, they've stopped short of that. So why do these contradictions still prevail?
That's a very good question, because I think even even members of the ruling dispensation several times would perhaps, in my view, be very, a lot of, Savarkar's policies would be implemented and followed, but to own them up or give credit to him would perhaps be anathema because of, again, the persona non grata that he has always been since independence. So his policies get adopted, some of it a mishmash of his and Gandhiji's, and that's how I think, even the constitution was a confluence of multiple ideas, multiple ideological streams coming together in this, document that we have as the founding visionaries of this nation. But then, many of his ideas, I think they were far ahead of his times, including his views on, a complete casteless society is an idealist view, which is certainly an important objective to work towards. But then other things in society like cow worship, which is very topical today, where Savarkar actually, would raise the heckles of the orthodoxy by saying that he does not consider the cow as being worthy of worship. It's a very important, very utilitarian animal which can be used, which needs to be protected, but raising an animal to the level of divinity is an insult to both man and God and so on. In fact, he says Hindutva's deity should be Narasimha, the man lion, ready to pounce on its enemies and those who attack it, and not a docile cow, because you become the god you worship. So certainly a lot of this, as you can well imagine, in those times in the 1920s and 30s, when he said all this and wrote all this profusely, it really rattled the orthodoxy, and that was also one reason why there were perhaps a lot of differences between him and the RSS. He was never part of the RSS, though his elder brother Baba Rao was one of the founding fathers of the RSS. So that's also, I document in the book, that this is probably one of his failings as a leader. He did not cultivate a second rung of leadership. There was so much of dissension and intra-party feuds between him and his protege, Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the founder of the Jan Sangh and the other ideological fountainhead for the current BJP. But he and Shyama Prasad, though they were in the same party, the Hindu Mahasabha, there were always these factions, the Maharashtra faction under Savarkar, the Bengal faction and the North Indian faction, which was putting its weight under Mukherjee. So that there was these subtle tensions between the two, and that was one of his failings, of not being able to convince people of many of his far-reaching, earth-shattering kind of reforms, and also especially in social reforms, and not building that legacy forward, where these could also be put into practice in terms of policy. And to be in politics, I think one needs to be a little bit of a pragmatist. You can't be a nihilist like he was. You need to take people along. You need to build consensus, which is what I think a Gandhi understood very well. He understood the pulse of the people. And so he, introducing elements of religion, whether it was starting with the Khilafat movement to woo the Muslims, or the use of Hindu symbolisms in the form of bhajans, or the use of phrases like Ram Rajya and all of that. He understood that we are a deeply religious society, and all of this and the whole demeanor of a saint, leading them, is something that would be more appealing to the people than someone who's telling them that, your cow is not worthy of worship, Brahmins need to marry the lower caste, all of this, which were very good principles and ideals to follow, but the way it needs to be implemented, particularly in a society like ours, which is both very, very divided as well as orthodox, I think it needs to be done step by step, which he was probably a man in a hurry to implement them soon, and that's one reason why his followers started dwindling, and also the Hindu Mahasabha as a party itself completely got wiped out after 1946.
So Vikram Sampath, let me ask you, Savarkar's own definition of who is a Hindu, was that the beginning of the problem as we see it, as tensions between Hindus and Muslims even before independence? He said, the one who considers this vast stretch of land called Bharat from Sindhu, that is the Indus, to the Sindhu, which is the sea, as the land of one's ancestors and holy land, he is the one who will be termed and remembered as a Hindu. Do you think this excludes, because he calls it the Holy Land, what happens to the Muslims, the Christians, the Parsis, and the Jews who were still in India at that point in time? Does it have an exclusionist reference of Hindutva, definition of Hindu and Hindustan as it was called earlier?
The treatise Hindutva too, I think it's very important to understand the context in which he made, this formula of, who a Hindu is. And it was in the backdrop of the Khilafat movement where, Gandhiji had for the first time, in my view, a very, very pernicious way to bring religion into politics, where, the Muslims of India were being mobilized on a communal issue of re-establishment of the caliphate in Turkey. Which the British had won in war, and the people of Turkey themselves wanted Mustafa Kemal Ataturk to lead the country. Whereas here in India, because a section of the Muslims, considered the caliph as a holy figure and a descendant of the prophet and so on, they were being mobilized, saying, we will help you agitate and re-establish the caliphate in Turkey, in return for which you need to support us in the non-cooperation movement. And in fact, historian R.C. Majumdar mentions that by doing this, Gandhi probably somewhere tacitly himself said that the Muslims did not belong to this country but to some other country. Why should the concerns of a country which was so far away from India, why should that matter to us at a time when we were a slave nation, we were fighting for our independence? So we don't have to put a premium for somebody's support to our, to their participation in the emancipation of this country. And in that context is where Savarkar coined this Punya Bhu and Pitru Bhu, the land of the ancestors, and also Punya Bhu, the holy land. Of course, it has connotations of, where all your holy places are, but it's also, he mentions it's not linked to religion. Right at the beginning of the treatise, he says Hindutva has nothing to do with the theological constructs of Hinduism as a religion. So holy here meant your devotion, your allegiance to the nation, and not extraterritorial, concerns or allegiances, which was very harmful and detrimental to national sovereignty at that time. And we were seeing the the separatist tendencies that were there, and the eventual vivisection of the country on religious lines. In that same treatise, he also mentions, what do we do with people like, say, Sister Nivedita or, Annie Besant, it was not their ancestral land, it was not their Pitrubhu, but then he says they were still going to be considered as Hindus because they did a lot more for this country than indigenous Indians did. So that made it very clear that the holiness did not come from religion, but the work one did, the patriotic feelings one had for this landmass, and did not base one's actions in this country and tie it up to some other country, extra political thing, the larger Ummah, about which even Dr. Ambedkar, cautions, saying this larger universal brotherhood and so on, that inherently creates a tendency of separatism and two nations. And so that was what
so are you saying Savarkar was misunderstood? Are you saying Savarkar was misunderstood and seen as a divisive figure which kept Muslims as a completely different entity, because their place of worship, their main place of worship is outside of the so-called holy land that he described as Bharat, and the Christians who also, have their holy land outside of India. Do you think even the fact that he described who a Hindu is and includes Annie Besant in it and Sister Nivedita in it, people have deliberately tried to attach a whole lot of conspiracy theories to what Savarkar's view was? And who did that?
I think the problem would have been solved if he had coined the term Bharatiya or Bharat, instead of Hindu. But then he has an explanation for that too, because saying what's in a name, as Shakespeare had said. He said in the case of our country, there is a lot to a name, because the word Sindhu Nadi, which the Arabs and others called as Hindu, and everything to the west, to the east of the Indus being called Al-Hind and so on. So there is a lot to the name, the history associated with it, the romance of it and all of that. So that name for him was important. But then I think the proof of the pudding is in eating it, and so the documents, whether it was his speeches, presidential speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, or even a document, Navika, that I unearthed, which probably very few people would know. There was a constitution of Free Hindustan State, which the Hindu Mahasabha came up in 1945, 5 years before the actual Constitution of India was drafted, which has very, very similar views on secularism, on the role of minorities and so on. And Savarkar himself says there did not even be a ghost of suspicion in the minds of minorities that their legitimate rights, be it cultural, linguistic or religious rights, would be entrenched upon by this Hindu Rashtra, and everybody is equal in the eyes of the law. The majority community would not get any extra privileges on basis of numbers, and on the converse, the minorities also would not get any concessions on this basis. Everybody is free to practice and profess their religion, and in the Constitution of Free Hindustan, it explicitly mentions among 16 fundamental rights that it lists, one is freedom to practice, profess, preach their religion. There is no second class citizenship for any community. Everybody who has a domicile of 6 to 7 years in this country or have parents here is a citizen of India, and there is not going to be any state religion of Hindustan as a whole or to any of the provinces therein. So I think these policy documents, these statements, public statements in positions of authority that he was as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, and their own document, I think that says it all about what the policy of the most, the alleged, ultra right party of India was. It was of a secular nation where everybody was truly equal, and the majority community is not going to get the short end of the stick as it is now in terms of temples being controlled by the government, or the stepmotherly treatment that is allegedly given to members of the majority. So everybody being equal in the eyes of the law is a true sense of secularism by the mention of the word.
पर कोई ये मानता नहीं है आज की डेट में भी कि सावरकर जी सेक्युलर थे. And that tag, and that question keeps chasing him. And I want to ask you, the RSS today under Mohan Bhagwat ji also refers to the Hindu Rashtra, and then gets clubbed, even though, there wasn't as much understanding between RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha and Savarkar then. People associate them as clones of each other today. I want to ask you the question, is it because history was written the way it was? Is it because different people have interpreted history in their own way to create these mindsets and perceptions? And are you now introducing your own perception to correct the historical past, because it will also be seen as one version of the truth? Where do you think you stand on the analysis and the deciphering of these different versions of the truth?
Navika, I always hold that there is no absolutist the truth when it comes to history. History, as a famous historian had said, every account of history is an interim report. So everybody is actually researching, finding new facts and documents which can change the complete narrative of history. And that is the beauty of the discipline, which allows for these multiple voices to blossom. And that is the precise problem in India, where there has been just one dominant hegemonic, version of history, particularly post-independence, and even, particularly of the freedom movement, as also, the invasions and so many, all the troubled aspects of our long, stormy past. So I wouldn't call myself a revisionist historian or somebody who's trying to correct any wrongs. It's just, I think the duty of a conscientious historian is to illuminate the records, illuminate the facts, and let the discerning reader make up his or her mind, because I think that is very, very important. So many aspects of history have been hidden from our generations, especially post-independence. I'll just give you one example, which was after Mahatma Gandhi's tragic assassination, very few people in India would actually know that there was a pogrom very similar to the anti-Sikh riots that were done in Delhi in 1984. So just swap the digits. In 1948, you had a carnage that was conducted against the Brahmins of Maharashtra across the state, starting from Bombay, Pune, and then Nagpur to Satara, Sangli, the Miraj, the Patwardhan states, Kolhapur, all of this, where thousands and thousands of Brahmins, either they were massacred or their properties destroyed, and this was done by congressmen. And I state this in the book, probably for the first time ever in print, that this was something that was done by leading Congress, office bearers. And this was from the accounts of Dwarka Prasad Mishra, who was the Home Minister of the Central Provinces, a congressman himself, who says many Congress office bearers were implicated. More than 100 Congress workers were arrested in Nagpur, for this carnage. But then cases were not filed, FIRs were not registered, and this entire episode, it's almost today's generation would not even know, even in Maharashtra, that there was perhaps a carnage like this. And in fact, in the process of the research for this book, I put it out on social media saying, can you come out with, it was a crowdsourcing attempt, saying your family histories, oral narratives, because there's no documented proof. And I was, amazed and both, very, very appalled by the outpouring of stories that came, and many of them, still wanting to remain anonymous, because the people who led the mobs, those parties or the descendants or so on, they are still in positions of power in Maharashtra, and so nobody would want to risk their lives even now, 70 years after this unfortunate incident happened. So that is how I think history, when we suppress it, when we make it a very, very, we sugarcoat it and whitewash it, it has a tendency to keep erupting in our face and lead to lots and lots of social as well as political discords. I've always maintained we've never come to terms with our past. We've never acknowledged these wounds of the past, healed them and moved on. And that's the reason why history becomes such a live battlefield and, for contemporary politics today as well.
The fact that is contested till today is, would Savarkar not have known that Nathuram Godse and Narayan Apte, belonging to the Hindu Mahasabha, and knowing Savarkar very well, did not keep him in the loop about their plans?
Few hours before, minutes before Gandhi's murder too, the two of them met, and Gandhi has promised to patch them both up over the next couple of days. So he was not even in charge of the Home Ministry, but still people who were viewed as threats and opponents within and outside the party and the government needed to be fixed.
Vikram Sampath, you mentioned, and there cannot be a book on Savarkar unless we talk about the assassination of Gandhi, and we've referred to it, a bit in the interview earlier. But I want to ask you, he was eventually acquitted in the Red Fort trial in 1948. Yet, the fact that is contested till today is, would Savarkar not have known that Nathuram Godse and Narayan Apte, belonging to the Hindu Mahasabha, and knowing Savarkar very well, did not keep him in the loop about their plans? I also want to ask you, was there political rivalry at play, because Morarji Desai was then the Home Minister of Bombay. Digambar Badge was an approver and named Savarkar as having given his blessings, and he later turned an approver. And the bodyguard of Savarkar and his assistant, Mr. Damle, who is reported to have claimed during the statement to the police that he heard Savarkar say to Godse and Apte, "Tumhi yashasvi yunya." So clearly, either all this actually happened, or there was a political conspiracy to fix Savarkar. What does your book say about that, if you could share with our viewers?
Yeah, I think that brings the elephant in the room, which is, I think, despite being honorably acquitted by the court, not as is made out for lack of evidence, but because there was no connection between him and the murder. Though of course Godse, Apte were his associates in the Hindu Mahasabha and also the Hindu Rashtra Dal, the Boy Scouts that was formed within the Hindu Mahasabha to counter the RSS with whom they had a fallout with under Golwalkar. Despite that, there was, I mean, all the correspondences between them was perused by the prosecution, but nothing came out, and that's how Justice Atmacharan acquitted Savarkar, the only one to be acquitted among the 9 people who were caught in the case. But I think the biggest clue to what actually happened in this case was came from none other than the law minister of the country then, Dr. Ambedkar. And I mentioned that in the book that based on sources again, that he actually called up Bhopatkar, who was the lawyer of Savarkar, saying, I need to meet you. And then at a particular place in Delhi, and then he was driving the car himself, and then he asked Bhopatkar to get inside the car, and he says, there's not a shred of evidence against your client, and it's all being done by the highest political leadership to fix your client, and he will get away because there's no evidence against him. The cabinet is also vastly divided on this issue, and Bhopatkar's quote, which I mentioned there, and leave it at that, saying, Jawaharlal Nehru, why would he do that? That was one of the conjectures which was very rife in political circles and discussions then, that systematically anybody who was a political opposition to the ruling dispensation then had to be done away with. We see that. I mean, Shama Prasad Mukherjee's mysterious death in Kashmir, or Sardar Patel, of course, was constantly being insinuated against, that he being the home minister was not had not taken enough steps to protect Mahatma Gandhi's life, whereas by 12th of January, Sardar Patel had virtually given up his 1948, about 18 days before Gandhi's murder. He had virtually given up his position as the home minister because of the differences he had with Nehru. Minutes before Gandhi's murder too, the two of them met, and Gandhi has promised to patch them both up over the next couple of days. So he was not even in charge of the home ministry, but still people who were viewed as threats and opponents within and outside the party and the government needed to be fixed, I guess, and he became a fall guy, because this whole issue, Yashasvi Hoon Ya, that Digambar Badge said, the prosecution's case was built only on this, and whereas there were 10 others who were countering it and saying that that was not true. In fact, Godse in his dying declaration himself states that from 1946-47, Savarkar had become very pacifist. He had almost started becoming very conciliatory towards the government, because he said it's a government of the Indians, we don't need to oppose it. It's a new fledgling government, so let's give it all support. And we had lost all our faith in the old brass of the Hindu Mahasabha. We decided to break away from them and chart our own course to protect Hindu lives and sovereignty. They had seen what had happened at Naukhali, at the refugee camps. They were so incensed, and the whole decision to murder Gandhi too happened only as late as 12th or 13th of January 1948. Because before then they had these fantastic ideas. Let's go and bomb the Pakistan assembly. Let's attack the Nizam's treasury while it's going from Maharashtra to Hyderabad state. All of these fancy amateur plans. But when Gandhi went on this fast, saying 500 crores had to be given to Pakistan at a time when Kashmir was being invaded by the Pakistani tribesmen and army people, in the guise of tribesmen, that was when these people decided that he had to be bumped off. And so in those 18 days, in a very, very amateur manner, this whole exercise was done. A revolver was procured from Gwalior and all of that. So it's very unlikely that in that limited time, this man could have given any advice. And Navika, finally, the conclusive evidence to this came up as late as 28th of March, I guess, in 2018. And I don't know, maybe the media missed out on that, where a PIL was filed in the Supreme Court by this man called Pankaj Phadnis, challenging the Kapoor Commission, which had implicated Savarkar without much corroborative evidence. So the Supreme Court, Honorable Supreme Court appointed an amicus curiae to go through the entire documents of the trial papers, the Kapoor Commission and so on, and it was headed by Justice Bobde, the former CJI, and Justice Nageshwar Rao, and they came out with this statement in 2018 that there is the trial court's verdict of Savarkar's acquittal continues to remain, and there is nothing, the petitioner's contention that the Kapoor Commission implicates Savarkar is totally unfounded, and he has been honorably exonerated. So once the highest court of the country, and after so many trials and so many relooks, when some person has been honorably let off, I think to keep putting on the albatross again and again on him might be a tad unfair to him, especially when he is not around to defend himself. But Sardar Patel had rightly said in a letter to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee that legally your leader may not be responsible, but the moral long shadow will remain on him, and that's precisely what's happened. The moral, the dark shadow of Gandhi assassination continues to haunt him even now when there's talk of Bharat Ratna and other things.
When you point the finger at politics of the time, when you refer to Nehru, well, you're trying to once again resurrect a dark shadow. I don't know how present day India is going to view that. We do have those who are the torchbearers, as I said, of freedom of expression and speech, who might have problems with that statement. But before I let you go, I know it's not possible to do justice to a 700-page book in just about 45 minutes, Vikram Sampath, but it's been a pleasure reading this. But I want to ask you a last question. Kamal Hassan called Godse a terrorist of those times, yet there are people in BJP who still eulogize Godse. Where do you think this binary is placed, and who's right and who's wrong? Can we ever say that?
To your earlier comment, Navika, I've made all these comments, and based on sources and facts which I've quoted in the book. So none of it is my personal, interpretation also. I'm just quoting sources as they are. So who considers them as sources, or who has a counter source to that? I think if you oppose a book, the best way is to write another book. So I hope all these champions of freedom of speech can come up with that. Now about this, I personally, a murder is a murder, and that can never be, whatever be the cause, you can't justify that. So it was a very, very heinous crime that Godse and his associates committed. And so, to an extent, those who probably, go on supporting this for whatever legitimate cause they may have, I don't think they have a leg to stand on. And we have none less than, I think, the Prime Minister himself, who admonished his MP, who, went on to say, she considered Godse as someone who was a patriot and so on. Patriot he perhaps was, but then the means he adopted was certainly wrong. But then very funnily, Navika, in 1926, when Swami Shraddhanand of the Arya Samaj was assassinated by a Muslim fanatic, Abdul Rashid, Gandhiji had refused to call him an assassin. He in fact called him my dear brother Abdul Rashid, and he said, you need to get into the psyche of an assassin. You should not blame him. I do not even consider him as having committed a crime. We all Hindus need to introspect as to what is it that forces an assassin to pick up a gun and shoot someone. And Swamiji was anyway old, so he has given his blood for the sake of the nation and all of that. That's what Gandhiji had said, and Savarkar had opposed him tooth and nail, and he in fact started a newspaper also called Shraddhanand in the memory of this saint of the Arya Samaj. Now, very ironically, it's a tragic irony that 20 years later, the same man who said we need to get into the psyche of an assassin gets assassinated himself, and then his followers who were fed on non-violence for so long actually go on a rampage and kill people who belong to the community of the assassins. So I think these contradictions are very, very pertinent for us to see as a society, as historians, sociologists, people in the media, and these corrective measures were not taken, and that's one reason why I think history has this very, very perverse tendency of repeating itself, the first time as a tragedy, the second time as a farce. If we had taken corrective measures of how to deal with political assassinations, 1984 might not have happened. So I think these are the lessons that one needs to learn, rather than put tags and definitions on people and characters of the past based on yardsticks and judgments of today and today's contemporary politics of terrorism. And
very well said, Vikram Sampath, because really, and, instead of standing up and questioning the interpretation of history, very rightly said by you, it is lessons from history that should actually worry all of us. Have we actually learned the lessons from history or not? That's the takeaway from this, Frankly Speaking, with Vikram Sampath. Thank you very much, Vikram Sampath, for joining me on this very engaging episode of Frankly Speaking.